The greedy soul, in trying to feel everything, ends up feeling nothing. Philosophers like the Buddha understood this long before the modern age. He saw desire as the root of suffering, not because pleasure is evil, but because attachment to it creates endless craving. When we depend on pleasure to define happiness, we become slaves to circumstance. The weather changes, the body ages, the novelty fades, and the soul, untrained in stillness, panics. This is why so many people today feel restless even when surrounded by abundance. Pleasure without purpose is emptiness in disguise. Yet pleasure itself is not the enemy. It becomes sacred when balanced with awareness. A meal savored with gratitude, music listened to with presence, touch shared with tenderness. These are not acts of greed, but of grace. The problem arises only when we seek pleasure as escape rather than expression. When we seek to fill a void, not celebrate fullness. In truth, pleasure reaches its highest form not in consumption, but in appreciation. The greedy heart asks, "How can I have more?" The awakened heart asks, "How deeply can I feel what I already have?" When one learns this, even the simplest moment, a breath, a sunset, a sip of water, becomes divine. For real pleasure is not in what we take, but in how fully we exist. Among all the greeds, the last is the oldest and the deepest, the greed for immortality. It is the fear that underlies every other desire. For what is greed, ultimately, if not a protest against impermanence? The wish to possess, to rule, to be remembered, all are ways of saying, "I do not want to die." Human beings are unique in their awareness of death, and that awareness terrifies us. From that terror, civilization was born. We built pyramids, wrote scriptures, composed symphonies, all to defy time. The pharaohs sought to preserve their bodies, the poets their names, the scientists their discoveries. Even love and art, in their highest forms, are attempts to carve permanence into the fleeting. But immortality is an illusion. Everything that begins must end. The stars themselves burn out, galaxies dissolve, names fade into dust. Yet the human ego cannot accept this. It clings to symbols of continuity, wealth, fame, legacy, even digital presence. In the modern world, we upload our memories, store our faces in archives, and imagine that data is eternity. But even data dies when the power goes out. Philosophically, the greed for immortality is a misunderstanding of life's nature. We believe that to live forever is to triumph over death, but in truth, it is death that gives life meaning. The beauty of a flower lies in its fragility, not its permanence. The sweetness of love comes from knowing it cannot last forever. If every sunset were eternal, we would no longer look up to see it. Mortality is not a curse. It is the frame that makes existence art. Religions have offered comfort in the promise of an afterlife. Whether heaven, reincarnation, or cosmic return, these ideas soothe the human need for continuation. But even spiritual longing can become greedy when it seeks reward instead of understanding. The person who does good only to secure paradise is still bargaining with eternity. The true mystic, however, surrenders the self completely, realizing that the self was never separate from the eternal to begin with. The modern age pursues immortality through science, anti-aging, genetic engineering, artificial intelligence. We seek to outsmart time with technology, to upload consciousness into machines. But even if we succeed, will we be truly alive? Or will we have traded humanity for endurance, presence for permanence? The greed for immortality may end not in salvation, but in alienation, as we forget that death is not the opposite of life, but its completion. To accept mortality is to find peace. To embrace the finite is to touch the infinite. The wise do not fight death. They learn to live so deeply that every moment becomes eternal. As the mystic Rumi said, "Die before you die." It means to let go of clinging, to dissolve greed, to merge with what is beyond beginning or end. That is true immortality, not the continuation of the body, but the awakening of the soul. And so, we return to the beginning, to that first spark of desire, to the ancient whisper of more. We have seen greed wear 7 masks: wealth, power, fame, knowledge, love, pleasure, and immortality. Each begins as a form of beauty, security, leadership, expression, understanding, affection, joy, transcendence, and each becomes corrupt when the heart forgets gratitude. The essence of all greed is forgetfulness, the forgetting of enough. Humanity's greatest illusion is that fulfillment lies ahead, in the next thing, the next goal, the next possession. Yet enough has always been here, in this breath, this moment, this awareness. The greedy heart looks outward. The awakened heart looks inward. The greedy one asks, "What more can I have?" The wise one asks, "What more do I need?" Greed is not the enemy of humanity. Unconsciousness is. For when we awaken to our own motives, greed loses its grip. When we see that no external thing can complete us, desire transforms into appreciation. Wealth becomes generosity, power becomes service, knowledge becomes humility, love becomes freedom, pleasure becomes gratitude, and mortality becomes meaning. Every greed, when illuminated, reveals its sacred opposite. Perhaps the purpose of life is not to eliminate desire, but to refine it, to turn the hunger for possession into the hunger for understanding, the hunger for control into the hunger for compassion. The world does not need less passion. It needs more awareness. When desire serves love instead of fear, creation instead of consumption, it ceases to be greed. It becomes life itself, flowing and free. So the next time the whisper of more rises within you, do not silence it, but listen closely. Ask what it truly seeks. Beneath the noise of wanting lies something pure, the longing not to have, but to be. The soul's deepest hunger is not for things, but for wholeness. And wholeness begins not with abundance, but with enough. Pleasure is the most immediate and deceptive of all human greeds. It is the one that disguises itself not as a vice, but as a reward. Every bite of sweetness, every moment of comfort, every thrill that electrifies the senses, pleasure whispers, "You deserve this." And in that whisper, humanity finds both its most delicate joy and its most dangerous trap. In the beginning, pleasure is innocent. It is a natural response to life's gifts. The taste of ripe fruit after hunger, the warmth of the sun on a cold morning, the laughter shared between friends. But over time, the mind begins to chase these moments. What was once spontaneous becomes sought, and what was once simple becomes demanded. Pleasure ceases to be a surprise. It becomes a pursuit. In this pursuit, something subtle happens. The more pleasure we chase, the less satisfaction it brings. Psychologists call it hedonic adaptation, the tendency for human happiness to return to a baseline no matter how much joy we experience. The first indulgence thrills us. The second satisfies. The 10th numbs. And soon, the pleasure that once filled us begins to feel hollow. Human civilization, for all its achievements, is built upon this endless chase. Entire industries exist to feed the pleasure instinct: entertainment, fashion, luxury, cuisine, technology. They promise happiness through consumption, but what they truly deliver is repetition. We return again and again, not to experience pleasure, but to remember what it felt like. The memory of joy becomes more powerful than joy itself. Philosophers across ages have warned against this addiction. Epicurus, often misunderstood as a hedonist, actually taught that the highest pleasure was the absence of pain, not indulgence. True joy, he said, was found in simplicity, in appreciating the small, stable pleasures that sustain the soul. Yet modern humanity has twisted his wisdom into its opposite, a culture of excess that confuses stimulation with satisfaction. Technology has magnified this greed 1,000-fold. With a single swipe, one can summon food, entertainment, connection, even simulated affection. But the instant accessibility of pleasure erodes its depth. What once required patience, skill, or intimacy can now be achieved in seconds. And in removing effort, we remove meaning. The feast loses flavor when it is endless. The greed for pleasure also reshapes morality. When desire becomes the measure of right and wrong, ethics dissolves. What feels good becomes justified, and restraint becomes outdated. Yet unrestrained pleasure often leads to suffering, not immediately, but inevitably. The mind addicted to pleasure loses resilience. It forgets how to endure discomfort, how to wait, how to hope. It becomes fragile, dependent, restless. At its deepest level, pleasure's greed is not about the body but the emptiness within the spirit. We seek pleasure to fill silence, to drown thought, to escape awareness of our own impermanence. Every indulgence, every thrill, is a small rebellion against mortality, a way to forget that we are fleeting. But pleasure, no matter how abundant, cannot conquer the truth that every high is followed by a fall. And yet, pleasure itself is not evil. It becomes destructive only when it replaces purpose. To live without joy is to live half a life. To live only for joy is to live without meaning. The wise learn to let pleasure come and go like waves, felt, appreciated, but never possessed. They understand that true pleasure is not the intensity of sensation, but the peace of balance. In the end, the greed for pleasure teaches us the same lesson that all greeds do, that abundance without awareness leads to emptiness. The more we consume, the less we feel. The more we chase, the further we drift. Real pleasure, perhaps, is not in the act of having, but in the art of savoring. If pleasure is the most seductive of greeds, immortality is the most tragic. It is the final and ultimate desire, the refusal to accept the one truth that humbles all creation, that everything ends. The greed for immortality is the shadow of fear that follows every human step. It is not always about living forever, but about refusing to fade. This greed takes many forms. Some seek it through religion, believing in eternal life beyond death. Others seek it through legacy, names carved into history, monuments, books, inventions. Some turn to science, chasing biological or digital immortality. But behind every form lies the same question: why must I cease to exist? Philosophers from ancient Greece to modern existentialism have wrestled with this question. Socrates taught that the soul is immortal, yet he also accepted death calmly, as if to prove that eternity matters only to those who fear the present. Nietzsche, on the other hand, mocked the idea of an afterlife, urging humanity to embrace eternal recurrence, to live as if one's life were to repeat forever. Both men, in their own way, sought to reconcile with mortality, not escape it. But the modern world is not content with acceptance. The 21st century has turned immortality into a technological ambition. Scientists study genetic engineering, cryonics, and mind uploading. Billionaires fund research to defeat aging. In this pursuit, we see the purest form of greed, the desire not just to have more, but to never lose. Yet immortality, even if achieved, would be its own curse. What is meaning without the shadow of ending? Death gives value to life precisely because it limits it. A sunset is beautiful because it fades. A song moves us because it ends. Eternity, stripped of contrast, becomes monotony. To exist without death is to exist without urgency, without appreciation, without art. The human spirit, however, cannot help but yearn. We dream of continuity not because we hate life, but because we love it too much to let go. The greed for immortality is born from love, from the unbearable thought of separation, from the ache of unfinished dreams. It is greed, yes, but also grief. Religions have long offered comfort for this grief. They promise not an escape from death, but a transformation. Heaven, reincarnation, spiritual transcendence, each reflects a different language of hope. Yet even these ideas can become distorted when interpreted as possession. When we cling to eternity as something to own, we turn faith into fear. The wiser response to mortality is not denial but harmony. Death is not the enemy of life, it is its completion. Just as silence gives shape to music, death gives shape to living. When we learn to see death as part of the pattern rather than its interruption, the greed for immortality begins to dissolve. To live well is to die well, not in painlessness, but in peace. The greatest immortality, perhaps, is not biological or spiritual, but moral, the continuation of kindness, knowledge, and courage through others. Our lives ripple through generations not by lasting forever, but by being worth remembering. In the end, the greed for immortality teaches us the most humbling truth of all, that what we seek to preserve is never the body, but meaning. And meaning cannot be stored, it must be lived. When the noise of the world quiets, when the lights dim and the screens fade, what remains within the human heart is not hunger, but reflection. After wealth, power, fame, knowledge, love, pleasure, and immortality have been chased and tasted what is left. What remains when the hands that grasp finally open? It is here, in this stillness, that humanity meets the mirror of enough. The word enough is simple, yet it is perhaps the most difficult truth to accept. It is the boundary that greed refuses to recognize. Greed does not always shout. Sometimes it whispers softly. Just a little more. A little more comfort, a little more control, a little more time. This whisper drives empires to rise, civilizations to expand, and individuals to exhaust themselves. And yet, history shows that nothing is ever enough for those who cannot see the beauty of limits. To confront the idea of enough is to face our greatest fear, that we are not infinite. Our time, energy, and desires all exist within boundaries. But boundaries are not prisons. They are the outlines that give shape to meaning. A life without limits would be a blur without definition, a painting without edges. In contrast, a life with boundaries, of time, of choice, of mortality, forces us to value what truly matters. Philosophers from Stoics to Buddhists have spoken of this peace, the art of sufficiency. The Stoic Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." The Buddha, centuries earlier, taught that craving is the root of suffering, and liberation begins when craving ends. Both voices, distant in time yet united in wisdom, remind us that freedom lies not in acquiring more, but in needing less. The mirror of enough is not a rejection of desire, it is its transformation. Desire gives motion to life. It builds, creates, explores. But when desire becomes greed, it turns inward, feeding on itself. The balance lies not in suppression, but awareness. To desire wisely is to understand the difference between nourishment and excess, between wanting and worshiping. Look around the modern world, and you'll see how difficult this balance has become. Every day we are told that we lack something: beauty, success, wealth, recognition, excitement. Our culture thrives on dissatisfaction. It teaches us that joy is always elsewhere, in the next product, the next experience, the next version of ourselves. And so, we live perpetually in tomorrow, rarely in today. To stand before the mirror of enough is an act of rebellion. It is to say, I have enough for this moment. It is to silence the engines of endless wanting and rediscover gratitude. Gratitude, after all, is the antidote to greed. Where greed counts what is missing, gratitude counts what remains. Where greed breeds restlessness, gratitude breeds stillness. Yet this stillness is not stagnation. It is clarity. When we cease to chase what we do not need, we begin to see what truly enriches life: connection, compassion, purpose, creation, kindness. These are not possessions. They are experiences that multiply when shared. A generous heart, unlike a greedy one, grows larger the more it gives away. The 7 greeds are not separate sins. They are reflections of one condition: the confusion between having and being. We believe that what we accumulate defines who we are. But identity built on possession is fragile, for it depends on what can be lost. The person who measures worth by ownership will always fear poverty. The one who measures it by virtue, by inner peace, by wisdom, will always remain rich. Perhaps that is the ultimate paradox. The more we let go, the more we possess. When we stop clutching for more, our hands become free to hold what matters. The wealth of the heart is not in gold, but in understanding. The power of the soul is not in domination, but in harmony. The immortality of meaning is not in escaping death, but in leaving behind love. So the question returns, what is enough? Enough is the meal shared, not the feast hoarded. Enough is the word of kindness spoken, not the fame shouted. Enough is the night's rest after honest work, the laughter of one friend, the moment of silence where no craving calls your name. Enough is not a number, it is a state of awareness. The 7 greeds will always exist. They are not demons to be destroyed, but shadows to be understood. In their hunger, they remind us of our vitality, our curiosity, our longing for life. But we must learn to master them, lest they master us. For greed, unchecked, is the slow erosion of the soul, a fire that consumes its own warmth. In the end, To understand greed is to understand the human condition itself. We are creatures born of desire, yet capable of transcendence. The journey of philosophy is not to erase our wants, but to illuminate them, to see clearly what leads us closer to truth and what leads us further from peace. If there is one truth that echoes through all ages, it is this: enough is not less, it is liberation. And perhaps that is the secret the universe has been whispering all along. The stars do not compete for brightness. The river does not hurry to reach the sea. The tree does not hoard its leaves. It releases them when their season ends. Nature has no greed, only rhythm. To live in harmony with that rhythm is to live wisely and to die without regret. In that understanding, the 7 greeds lose their hold. Wealth becomes gratitude. Power becomes responsibility. Fame becomes legacy. Knowledge becomes humility. Love becomes generosity. Pleasure becomes peace. And immortality becomes memory. That is the final mirror, the reflection of enough. And when you stand before it, truly still, you will see not what you lack, but what you already are. Thanks for watching. Take care and do subscribe.